It was an hour past midnight when Alan started to reconsider his life choices. Sure, he'd thought, go be a police officer, bust some drug cartels, do some high-speed chases, the kind of stuff he'd always imagined cops did. Instead, here he was, sitting off the shoulder of some godforsaken highway in the middle of some godforsaken desert. Reality had a way of stamping out one's expectations, and it had thoroughly done that for him. He spent more time filing paperwork and writing tickets than actually driving his car, and even when something interesting did happen, he was always late to the party. He hadn't even fired his gun yet. What kind of cop was he that he'd never even shot his gun? He took another sip of coffee, dull, black, and unpleasant. He'd never been much of a coffee guy before, but night shift made it a necessity. Other guys used energy drinks or exercise, but Alan knew he was too lazy for all of that. The bitter drink worked well enough, but even with the slap in the senses it provided, he still could feel the pang of drowsiness taking hold. Wait in this spot with a speed camera and watch for speeders. All night long, every night, every single long, uneventful night. He might catch a few drunk college kids here and there, and that might lighten up the evening, but beyond that, his only company was the darkness of the lonely countryside. The light of a million long-dead stars twinkled above the man, while the ever-present crescent moon lorded over the landscape, painting strange shadows across the desert. Cacti and the odd tree seemed to be the only living things for hundreds of miles, save for the pudgy policeman in his cruiser. Every so often, some subterranean inhabitant of the desert underworld might rise from the sand, usually a lizard or a large spider. Beyond that, Alan felt totally alone. There was a certain solace in that kind of loneliness, feelings of insignificance, of ponderings and musings of the nature of things echoed in his mind as he reached a hand forwards to the radio. The knob turned on with a quiet click, and soon after the tiny LED screen illuminated with dull orange hues. The smooth tones of guitar and the rattling of drums flooded forth into the small cruiser. A man with a low southern drawl spouted some lyrics about a lost lover or some such. Alan didn't quite pay attention. He really only wanted some sound, some noise to cut through the overwhelming silence. It was the kind of silence that seemed to drown out everything. There were no crickets, no cawing nocturnal beasts, only this lonely man and his cruiser on the side of a desert road. A lonely man with just the recorded sounds of some other, likely equally lonely man to provide him company. Another sip of coffee, and Alan felt, in a way, content. Sure, it wasn't the worst job in the world. He'd done far worse in his day. It paid the bills, the kids stayed fed, Maureen stayed off his back about the student loans. It wasn't a perfect life, but really, what was? Sometimes, though, on desolate nights like these, he wondered if he really was happy. Happiness. That was a word that meant so little, yet to so many it meant the world. One had to be happy, had to be satisfied in this life in order to really live. Did they, though? Alan sat, cranking his chair back as he pondered. Did one really need to be happy in life? Wasn't it enough just to get along, to survive? He sighed. Of course not. You had to be fulfilled in life. You had to find friends and lovers. You had to pursue your dreams. Then again, did it really all matter in the end? A depressing thought, but he ran with it. In the end, everyone would have to punch the ticket. Everyone would wither away and die, just like everything else. One day, all these cars and road signs and cacti would be nothing but dust. What then? Why even get out of bed in the morning? As the pudgy policeman continued his internal arguments, trading mental blows in his mind, he barely had time to react when a long convoy of cars came screeching past his cruiser. Alan practically flopped out of his seat as the convoy passed. A half dozen, then a full dozen, then 24 military vehicles of all types. Humvees with mounted guns, Stryker APCs, huge trucks with canvassed backs, filled with men, armed to the teeth, eyes glowing under night vision goggles. They watched him as they passed, and even a few gave Alan a passing nod. Above him, a pair of jet-black helicopters, armed with twin rocket pods, pounded the air with monstrous drone, vibrating the glass on Alan's cruiser. Only a few minutes after they passed, Alan saw a blinding light erupt in the distance, like someone had just turned the sun back on in the dead of night. Alan covered his eyes, shouting a string of obscenities as the light faded, replaced with a long, low rumbling. He could feel the car shaking. He could feel his body vibrate like a tuning fork as the ground quivered and quaked. His head pounded. His eyes felt like jelly. For the briefest moment, Alan thought that he would die here, on this lonesome highway, the victim of some terrorist attack or what have you. Yet just like that, it was over. The policeman held his head in pain. He could feel bile rising from his stomach. In a flash, he shoved open the cruiser door and doubled over onto the cold pavement. Another moment, and he blew chunks, all across the ground and his uniform. That didn't matter as much to him. What mattered was the low, red glow that began to manifest in the distance, further down the highway. With his sleeve, he wiped the vomit from his face. The glow was minimal, but bright enough that he could see it all across the distant horizon. A few mountains blocked most of it from view, but it didn't take him long to realize what exactly it was. It was a fire. A massive, enormous fire. His instincts kicked in instantly, and the officer dove into his car, shoved it into drive, and sped off down the highway. In his mind, he ran through the possibilities. There weren't many towns in that direction. There weren't even that many people living out here. Just the odd rancher or quiet redneck. It didn't make sense. What in God's name had happened? Just as his mind was beginning to adjust to the sudden change, he slammed the brakes. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Up ahead, just off the side of the road, were a pair of transport trucks. One was overturned, while the other looked like it had simply pulled off the side of the road. Alan slid the car into park and, clutching his handgun closely, stepped out of the cruiser and back into the cold desert air. With the fearful steps of some hunted animal, the policeman approached the two cars. He kept the handgun gripped tightly, like some kind of talisman, against his chest. The first truck, pulled over to the side, seemed untouched. He peeked up into the cabin through the driver's side window and found that only the passenger door had been left open. Curious, he popped the door open and peeked inside. Nothing save for a few maps and a pair of sunglasses on the visor. Alan sighed and hopped down. Just as he did, a cool breeze picked up, and he caught a strange scent on it. The smell of electricity, like dust burning on a light bulb. Alan perked up a bit and slowly made his way around the side of the truck, only to stop dead in his tracks. There, off to the side of the road, was a soldier. What was left of him, at least. Alan froze, hands quivering. He slowly stepped forwards, muttering a few swears to himself as he did. He didn't understand. He didn't get it. As he stood over the body, he realized that the smell was coming directly from it. It looked like the man had been microwaved or baked. His clothes were melted onto his skin. His eyes and hair had disintegrated completely. The corpse sat there, contorted into a position of absolute agony as the policeman ran his hands through his greasy hair, feeling the panic beginning to take hold. The corpse seemed to hum with some residual energy, and Alan could even feel a bit of heat coming from its blackened exterior. That was enough to turn him back to the car. He'd seen enough. He was done. He was going back to the station to find out what in God's name he'd stumbled into. His eyes had just drifted from the corpse to the car when he stopped dead in his tracks. Off in the distance beyond the highway, just barely 100 feet from him, was a man. He stood in a patch of barren desert just past the second overturned truck. Alan eyed him closely, then, with handgun close once more, he stepped forwards. The man merely watched him as Alan slowly, methodically made his way to the car. There was something so off, so wrong about the darkened figure that he couldn't quite place. Even still, he had a job to do, and while trying to hide his panicked tone, he called out to the figure. Hello? Lincoln County Police. Who's there?" The figure just stood there, totally still, as Alan felt a chill pang up and down his spine as the moonlight reflected off its jet-black eyes. It wasn't a man. He threw the car door open, and the figure burst into a full sprint. Alan practically dove inside and threw the car into reverse. The figure slammed into the driver's side window as it moved, and Alan screamed as he stared directly into the creature's face. A massive mouth dominated it, with hundreds, maybe thousands of spiny teeth within, dripping with the blood of its last victim. The rest of the creature's body was mostly obscured, but Alan made the color of its eyes and its body jet black. As the car continued to reverse, Alan watched as the teeth began to scrape at the window. He shifted and slammed his foot against the accelerator, and the car jolted back down the highway in the opposite direction, flinging the creature back into the abyss of the desert night. Alan could feel beads of sweat rolling down his forehead. He could feel his heart about to burst out of his chest. Questions filled his mind as he careened down that once quiet desert highway. The thing wasn't a man. It looked like a man, but it wasn't. It was something else. He looked to the clock, and his pulsating heart nearly stopped dead. It was 8 in the morning. He'd lost 8 hours? How? He'd only been at the convoy for a few minutes. He checked his watch. 8 a.m. His phone. 8 a.m. Everything that could feasibly tell time, he checked, and they all said the same thing. 8 in the morning. The policeman slammed his hands on the wheel. Horror, revulsion, fear all flooded through his mind as he pulled over to the side of the road. He nearly ripped the radio out of its socket and screamed into it. "This is Officer Alan McDaniels, Lincoln County Police. Can anyone hear me?" Silence was all the response he needed. He slid back in his seat, flabbergasted and terrified. He barely thought of anything for 20 minutes, until, finally, a thought crossed his mind. He could use the sun. Why wasn't the sun up yet? Breath caught in his throat as he examined the sky. He was right, as much as he prayed he wasn't. The sun hadn't come up. The moon still sat, glued in the sky like a mocking specter. Alan shook his head. No, this was wrong. This was all wrong. Everything. He shrieked and howled and went up in utter, indescribable panic as he tried every radio frequency he could find. No one responded. Not a single person. He was alone, truly now. As the tears flowed down his face, he laid it against the dashboard. His children, his wife. Were they trapped too? Was he dead? Alan raised his head once more, and his whole body seemed to stop functioning. Time stopped dead as he looked ahead to see the same 2 trucks he had sped so quickly away from. The 2 trucks that had to have been 10 miles behind him by the time he stopped. One overturned, one still intact. A charred body, a man that was not a man. It was as if he was caught in some kind of nightmarish Groundhog Day. The creature's gaze caught Alan's, and it started to approach his cruiser once more. Alan could only cry as it skulked ever closer, seemingly taking its time to torture the poor man. As it did, even more of these things emerged with it from the brush on either side of the road, their eyes all locking with Alan's gaze. In unison, they arrived at his car and pressed their spindly fingers against the windows, tapping as if to taunt their prey before consuming it. Tap, tap, tap. Their thousands of white fingers scraped against the window like nails down a chalkboard. Alan closed his eyes and began to scream into the hopeless nothingness. And the sun never rose.